When people remember Jacksonville in 1901, they remember the fire. They remember a city consumed in hours. 146 blocks gone. Thousands left homeless. More than 2,000 buildings reduced to ash before the day was done. That is the story above ground. But beneath the burned city, another story may have surfaced for a brief moment and then been buried again. Because once the cleanup began, workers digging through the ruins appear to have uncovered something no reconstruction report was prepared to explain. Not just old cellars, not just drainage lines, not just forgotten utility spaces beneath a growing southern port, but chambers, passages, ventilation shafts, structural grids, entire layers of brick-built infrastructure extending far below the known city. And the deeper they went, the less it looked like Jacksonville had simply burned. The more it looked like Jacksonville had been built on top of something older. The Great Fire of 1901 remains one of the most destructive urban fires in American history. In just a few hours, the commercial heart of Jacksonville was gutted. Streets blackened, blocks collapsed, foundations cracked open. What remained was a landscape of debris, unstable walls, and urgency. The city had to rebuild quickly. Business had to return. Ground conditions had to be assessed before new foundations could be trusted. So engineers and labor crews were sent in with a practical task: clear the wreckage, stabilize the ground, inspect the substructure, prepare the city to rise again. On paper, it was straightforward. But disaster recovery has a way of doing something official. History rarely likes to emphasize. It opens the ground. It strips away the finished surface and exposes layers that were never meant to become part of the public story. And in Jacksonville, if the surviving fragments are read carefully, that may be exactly what happened. At first, the discoveries were easy to dismiss. Basements, perhaps, old storage rooms, merchant cellars, forgotten storm drains. Sinkholes and utility voids in a region already known for difficult geology. That was the safe explanation. It was also the explanation that seems to have grown weaker the further the digging went, because what the workers appear to have encountered was not random. It was organized. That is the first detail that changes everything. Instead of isolated underground spaces, crews reported layers of construction following coherent alignments, corridors running beneath known streets, walls maintaining the same directional logic across different depths, structural passages appearing to connect with lower passages buried even farther below. It was as if multiple generations of building had followed a plan already present in the ground. That should not happen cleanly. Different eras do not usually align so perfectly. Different builders do not normally inherit hidden corridors they are not meant to know exist. Cities grow unevenly. They drift. They improvise. They overlap. But beneath Jacksonville, some of the surviving descriptions suggest the opposite. Order, repetition, continuity. The public story of the fire says almost nothing about any of this. Why would it Jacksonville's recovery was meant to symbolize resilience? The city was rebuilding, not excavating its own uncertainty. Newspapers celebrated renewal. Civic leaders emphasized speed. Architects spoke of a new Jacksonville rising from the ashes. But in internal notes from the recovery period, certain phrases reportedly appear again and again. Unforeseen structures, unexpected depth, origin unknown. That phrasing is revealing. Not because it proves a hidden city in any final sense, but because it preserves the moment when ordinary explanation began to fail. If all the crews had found were routine pre-fire basements, the language would have remained routine. Instead, the deeper the work went, the more the record seems to lose confidence. And confidence is often the first thing history sheds when it touches something it cannot comfortably classify. The photographs, as later described by those who saw them, deepen that discomfort. Workers standing beside brick archways far larger than expected, passages fitted with unusual precision, tunnel-like corridors extending beyond the footprint of known properties, masonry so clean in geometry and execution that even poor early photography could not hide the level of engineering involved. This did not look like rough, local improvisation. It did not look like hasty frontier construction. And it did not look like standard Spanish colonial work either. It looked systematic, deliberate, as if what lay beneath the burned district had once belonged to a coherent urban layer, not merely a collection of practical storage spaces. That impression only intensified as the crews moved below the first recognizable basement levels. Beneath the expected foundation depth, they reportedly encountered larger brick units, tighter mortar joints, and patterns of construction that appeared too exact for what Jacksonville's accepted timeline would comfortably allow. Some arches were described as flawless in curvature. Some passages were wide enough to suggest traffic rather than storage. Some layouts implied intersections, not isolated rooms. And that is where the story begins to shift from buried structures to buried planning. Because once multiple underground spaces begin to resemble streets' corridors and aligned districts, the question is no longer whether Jacksonville had old substructures. The question becomes whether Jacksonville had inherited a subterranean city plan. One of the most provocative details in the surviving fragments is orientation. This mattered to the engineers because it is one of the hardest things to explain away. According to later descriptions, the deeper layers beneath the burned district seem to have followed the same directional logic as the visible city above. Corridors aligned with surface streets. Walls shared bearings across depths. Lower structures continued on the same grid as upper ones even when separated by layers of fill and apparent age differences. That is not how urban accidents behave. That is how inherited systems behave. It was as though every generation that built on the site had knowingly or not followed an older layout already embedded in the ground. And once that possibility enters the story, the scale becomes harder to ignore. Because this was not just one chamber beneath one building. Reports and later recollections point toward a network extending beneath at least 17 blocks of the burned district, perhaps more. Some passages were wide enough to suggest wagon movement. Others reportedly contained raised sections along the sides, almost like walkways or sidewalks. Intersections appear to have existed. Ventilation shafts appear to have punctuated the system at regular intervals. Massive support columns stood beneath areas where the relatively light buildings above never should have required such strength. That detail may be one of the most unsettling of all. The lower infrastructure seemed built for loads heavier than the city above it. Think about what that implies. If the support system beneath Jacksonville was too substantial for the wooden and brick commercial blocks that burned in 1901, then either it was absurdly overbuilt or it had been designed for something else. Something larger, something more permanent, something that no longer stood above it. And that possibility turns the whole story darker, because now the underground spaces no longer look like mere secondary support. They begin to look like the surviving lower portions of a more substantial city, one whose upper layers were gone buried or replaced long before the fire ever exposed its underside. There are other details that pull in the same direction. Some of the deepest masonry reportedly showed signs of prolonged water exposure, flood marks, mineral deposits, erosion patterns more consistent with long submersion than ordinary damp basements. Brick surfaces weathered as though water had moved through them repeatedly over long periods. And yet there is no clear historical record of Jacksonville experiencing known flooding at those exact depths across the relevant district in recent centuries. That matters because it suggests a different sequence than the official story allows. Not a city slowly accumulating cellars, but a lower world overtaken by water sediment or both, and the brick itself seems to have raised further doubts. Some later references to salvaged material mention firing temperatures and compositions inconsistent with local expectations. Whether those later claims can be confirmed in full is a separate question. What matters for the narrative is that the people close to the material reportedly did not think they were looking at ordinary local masonry. They thought they were looking at a construction method that felt inherited rather than improvised, standardized rather than handmade. That impression returns again and again in these stories. Inheritance, not invention, as if later Jacksonville had not created the whole city from the ground up, but adapted itself to something already present. Then came the feature that makes the underground district feel less like a curiosity and more like a vanished environment. Ventilation. Officially later descriptions reduced many of the vertical shafts to drains, air pockets, or geological irregularities. But the accounts from workers who saw them suggest something more purposeful. Brick-lined vertical passages, repeating intervals, angled channels designed to create airflow. In some cases, remnants of what seemed to be louvers or adjustable covers. These were not random voids in the soil. They looked engineered. And engineered ventilation implies habitation. It implies sustained use. It implies that the spaces below were not merely for storage or occasional access, but for occupancy. That is a disturbing possibility, because if the underground levels had active ventilation, then they were not dead spaces forgotten under the city. They were part of a functioning district at some earlier point in time, a district extensive enough to require air circulation, structured enough to require wayfinding, strong enough to carry loads from above, planned enough to follow a uniform grid. By the time the recovery teams were confronting this, the simple explanations had already begun to unravel. Then came the scale. One of the most haunting claims in later retellings of the Jacksonville fire recovery is the number itself, more than 1,700 distinct subterranean structures documented in preliminary work before that figure reportedly vanished from subsequent records. If true, that number is devastating. Not 1,700 rooms, not 1,700 voids, distinct structures, foundations, walls, purposes, units within a coherent lower network that would not describe a few merchant cellars. It would describe an entire buried district. And if there really were that many lower structures beneath the burned city, the obvious questions become impossible to avoid. Who built them? Who used them? Why were they abandoned? And why does the number disappear once the record becomes more official? That disappearance is one of the most telling elements in the story. Because in many cases like this, it is not the surviving claim that matters most. It is the way the specific uncomfortable detail gets dissolved into vagueness. Later documents no longer speak of counts. They speak of old construction, previous development, lower works, substructures. The sharp edge of the discovery is rounded down until it can live safely inside bureaucratic language. That is not the same as disproof. It is narrative containment. The same pattern seems to appear in the mapping record. Pre-fire surveys, according to later claims, included occasional notations suggesting lower development basement districts or subterranean access in certain areas. After the reconstruction, such language becomes harder to find. Post-fire maps flatten the city into a more conventional surface story. Property references to lower levels seem in some cases to have been rewritten or simplified. The underground grid remains physically buried and administratively thinned out at the same time. That is the kind of pattern that leaves a stain on the historical record, even when direct evidence is incomplete. Because a city can bury things in more than one way. It can bury them in fill, in concrete, in new foundations, in new maps, in new language. And Jacksonville appears, at least in this telling, to have done all of it at once. By late 1901, much of what had been opened beneath the burned district was reportedly being filled again. Entire passages collapsed or sealed, entrances cut off, sound sections reburied as if urgency had replaced curiosity. Officially, the reasons were practical: safety, structural concerns, the need to rebuild quickly. And to be fair, after a citywide disaster, those reasons are real, but the pattern inside those reasons is what keeps the mystery alive. Because the most intact sections were often the first to disappear. The sound arches, the coherent corridors, the large ventilation-connected areas, the very spaces that seemed most likely to prove the lower district had once functioned as more than a collection of basements. That is what makes the burial feel selective, rather than merely practical. And selectivity changes the emotional temperature of the story. If the crews had simply encountered dangerous voids, the whole underground network could have been collapsed indiscriminately. But what seems to have happened instead, at least in fragments, is that the most coherent sections were returned to darkness, while the damaged or less revealing areas remained easier to explain. That does not require an explicit conspiracy to matter. It only requires a city that could not afford to let its future be delayed by questions its past had suddenly begun to ask. Sometimes suppression is not theatrical. Sometimes it looks like urgency. Sometimes it looks like building permits. Sometimes it looks like a foreman deciding that what lies below will remain below, because no one in power is willing to stop everything and let the ground rewrite the city. But even after the reburial, some details remained too strange to vanish cleanly. Artifacts were reportedly recovered that did not align with known Jacksonville businesses. Ceramic piping with maker's marks no registry accounted for. Metal fixtures using unfamiliar alloy compositions. Glass manufactured in styles regional historians later struggled to place. These are the kinds of small details that do not prove a hidden civilization by themselves, but they do something equally important. They create friction. They make the accepted story harder to move through without resistance. Then there are the inscriptions, not graffiti, not casual marks, but signs or symbols allegedly found at intersections and key points in the underground network, placed with enough consistency to suggest function rather than decoration. Some later readers dismiss them as contractor marks or ornamental patterns, but their positioning reportedly implied navigation. That matters because navigation signs imply traffic scale and regular use. You do not create an internal wayfinding language for a handful of isolated basements. You create it for a district. And once an underground district has ventilation street alignment, oversized support systems, repeated architectural standards possible, wayfinding, and a vanished structure count in the thousands, the official explanation begins to feel less like a solution and more like a refusal to follow the evidence into its natural conclusion. That conclusion may not be fully provable now. Too much was reburied. Too many records seem partial. Too much of the photographic material survives only in fragments or secondhand descriptions. But even incomplete evidence can create a pressure strong enough to change how a city feels. And Jacksonville, through this lens, begins to feel different. Not like a city that rose from swamp and timber into modernity, but like a city layered over something more extensive, more ordered, and perhaps much older than its accepted history comfortably allows. That is why the final weeks of the 1901 recovery matter so much. Because the project did not seem to end in understanding. It ended in closure. The deeper the teams went, the vaguer the notes became. Early entries by some accounts were detailed and almost energized by the archaeological significance of what was emerging. Later entries turned guarded, incomplete, administrative, as if the work had stopped being an investigation and started becoming a problem to be managed. And that shift in tone may be the most honest clue of all. Because when the record changes character before the evidence changes shape, it usually means someone has started deciding what can and cannot become part of history. By the time the rebuilt city rose, much of the lower world was gone again. Not gone in the absolute sense, just sealed, just collapsed, just filled, just hidden beneath the clean certainty of new foundations and faster civic memory. That is often how unsettling history survives, not in museums, not in textbooks, but in fragments, in whispers, in surviving photos no one fully explains, in map notations that disappear, in structural oddities beneath cities that are always rebuilding too quickly to look straight down. And this is where the question widens. Because if Jacksonville really exposed a buried district beneath 17 blocks of the modern city, then the issue is no longer only Jacksonville. The issue becomes whether other American cities have done the same thing, whether fire, earthquake, demolition, and urban renewal have repeatedly opened the ground just long enough for older layers to surface, only for them to be sealed again before they could alter the official story. How many other fires revealed what was below? How many other reconstruction projects became acts of burial? How many other cities sit on aligned lower worlds whose existence would force a much older and stranger timeline into view? Maybe the underground Jacksonville was nothing more than an unusually extensive substructure from an era of building we poorly understand. Maybe. But maybe it was something else. Something larger. Something inherited. Something built for a population and a purpose no surviving civic narrative is willing to name. Either way, the pattern remains. A buried grid, aligned layers, ventilation shafts, oversized supports, submerged masonry, a vanished structure count, maps rewritten after the fire, and a city that rebuilt itself directly over the one question it could not afford to answer. Perhaps that is why this story still lingers at the edge of the archive. Because it does not merely suggest forgotten rooms, it suggests forgotten scale. A lower city beneath the city, a district below the district, a Jacksonville before Jacksonville. And if even part of that is true, then the real significance of the 1901 fire is not only what it destroyed above ground, it is what it briefly exposed below. For one moment, the surface cracked open. Workers descended past the familiar layers. They found arches too perfect, corridors too systematic, supports too heavy, and underground streets too organized to belong comfortably to the city everyone thought they knew. Then the fill went back in. The maps changed. The records thinned. The rebuilt city rose. And what had been exposed became something more dangerous than ruin. It became implication, because if Jacksonville stands on top of an extensive buried district built by a population no official history now acknowledges, then the real question is not what was found in 1901. The real question is how many other American cities are resting on the same kind of silence. How many lower worlds have already been paved over? How many old grids still run beneath modern streets? How many buried districts are waiting under foundations, parking lots, courthouses, banks, and office blocks for the next fire collapse or excavation to open the ground again? Maybe we are not standing on origins at all. Maybe we are standing on lids. And maybe the most unsettling thing about Jacksonville is not that the underground city was found, but that it was found, counted, and then forgotten. If this stayed with you, there are more cities, buried districts, and hidden layers where the ground may be hiding far more than history admits.